Are the great Western nations quietly slipping into decline? From Canada to the United States, across Europe, and down to Australia and New Zealand, a storm of inflation, unaffordable housing, aging populations, and poorly planned mass immigration is testing the foundations that made these countries global magnets. But here's the twist. Downfall rarely looks like a dramatic crash. It looks like slower growth, fraying public services, mounting debt, and ordinary people feeling poorer year after year. Today, we'll unpack the 12 pressure points driving the decline narrative. Then we'll ask, is this the end of Western dominance, or a painful reset before the next chapter? In a few minutes, you'll see why inflation falling back toward targets hasn't made life feel cheaper, and why migration can boost GDP while lowering living standards per person if the basics aren't fixed. Stick around to the end for 4 realistic fixes that could bend the curve. 1. The downfall. Frame. What it really means. When people say the West is collapsing, they usually mean something more subtle. Living standards feel stuck. Wages don't keep up with prices. Housing eats half the paycheck. Healthcare, education, and infrastructure creak under demand. And politics? More polarized, less productive. This isn't the 1930s, it's erosion, not obliteration. Think of a house where the roof leaks, the walls crack, and repairs keep getting postponed. The house still stands, but every storm reveals a new weakness. Next up, the numbers behind the pain. Why inflation peaked, but bills still bite. 2. Inflation shock and the hangover. Between 2021 and 2022, inflation spiked across the West. The US saw 9.1% year-over-year inflation at the June 2022 peak. Canada hit 8.1% that same month. The Euro area reached about 10 to 11% in October 2022. Australia peaked near 7.8% in late 2022, and New Zealand around 687.3% in mid-2022. Those peaks have eased towards central bank targets, but the price level that jumped didn't roll back. You're paying new, higher baselines. That's why even as the inflation rate falls, life still feels expensive. The deeper issue is reset inflation. After a surge, we live in a higher cost world for essentials. Housing, energy, services. Wages catch up slowly, if at all. This breeds the feeling of decline. In 60 seconds, you'll see why housing is the linchpin, and why lower inflation doesn't fix a mortgage at 6 to 7%. 3. The housing trap. The West housing crisis is a slow-burn disaster. In the US, the home price-to-income ratio hit the highest in decades around 2022, pushing ownership out of reach for young families. Even with cooling in some markets, affordability remains historically strained. Canada faces worst-ever affordability in several major cities, despite some recent relief. Australia and New Zealand wrestle with record-low rental vacancies and steep rent rises, while many EU cities report high housing cost overburden. Households spending 40% plus of income on housing. Why this matters? Housing is the base of the pyramid. When shelter eats income, families delay children, restrict spending, and move farther from jobs. Productivity falls when commutes balloon, and talent clusters become unaffordable. Next, immigration. How it can grow GDP and strain services at the same time. 4. Mass immigration, power, pressure, and planning. Immigration is a superpower when infrastructure and housing keep pace. Western nations have leaned on newcomers to fill labor gaps and sustain population growth as birth rates fall. But when planning lags, benefits blur into backlash. Canada set high targets for permanent residents and recently began explicit caps on temporary entrants to calm pressure. The US recorded surging net international migration that lifted population growth. Australia posted very high net migration in 2022 to 2024 before easing. NZ saw record net migration in 2023, then a sharp drop as policy tightened. The EU counted millions of new non-EU arrivals in 2022 to 2023. The through line: Flows have been big, housing hasn't kept up, and cities feel the strain. Immigration is not the villain. Capacity planning is. Without coordinated zoning reform, infrastructure build-out, and skills alignment, you get GDP up, GDP per person flat, and political heat. Coming up, the demographic time bomb that makes immigration necessary, yet harder to absorb. 5. Demographics and the care economy. Western nations are aging fast. Fewer workers supporting more retirees means tight labor markets, rising care costs, and chronic skills shortages. That's part of why immigration is leaned on, but integration costs show up in language training, credential recognition, and housing. An older population also changes political priorities. More demand for pensions and healthcare, less appetite for risk or long-horizon investments. Governments face a fiscal squeeze. Spend more on aging while trying to invest in productivity. That's a hard circle to square. In the next section, the subtle culprit you don't see. Productivity, why doing more with less is the only exit. 6. Productivity, the missing engine. If housing is the base, productivity is the engine. The West's big win historically was getting better at making things from microchips to services faster than costs rose. Lately, productivity growth has been weak in many Western economies. Reasons: underinvestment in infrastructure, skills mismatches, red tape, and a lack of diffusion for cutting-edge tech, AI included, into ordinary firms. The paradox: AI hype is off the charts, but most small and mid-sized businesses still struggle to adopt, train, and retool processes. Without a broad-based productivity bump, inflationary pressures linger and real wages stagnate. Next, we follow the money. Public debt and why it quietly limits choices. 7. The debt constraint. During the pandemic and after, governments borrowed massively to buffer incomes and backstop economies. Combine that with higher interest rates and debt servicing becomes a line item monster. Every dollar spent on interest is one not spent on housing, healthcare, or infrastructure. This fuels the feeling of permanent austerity. Taxes inch up, services don't improve, and trust declines. Voters hear promises of build more homes and fix healthcare, but the money has to come from somewhere, and expensive debt shrinks the toolbox. If politics can't agree, local regions might. Next, how cities and states are improvising while national governments gridlock. 8. Polarization and policy paralysis. The West's secret advantage was once high institutional trust and policy stability. Today, polarization makes long-term deals on housing, energy, immigration, education hard to sustain. Policies flip with each election. Permits get stuck. NIMBY opposition kills housing near jobs. Trade-offs are dodged. Decline isn't fate, it's failure to coordinate. When builders, cities, transit, and universities pull in different directions, costs rise and delivery slows. That coordination, boring but vital, is the edge that competitive regions still have. Can any country break the spiral? The answer may lie in 4 levers you'll hear in the finale. 9. Energy, climate, and the cost of transition. Energy shocks helped ignite the inflation spike, especially in Europe. And the transition to cleaner energy, while essential, demands huge upfront investment. If grids, storage, and permitting lag, households get hit with volatile bills and industries stall. The West must build faster and cheaper, or risk importing more energy uncertainty. A confident West can do 2 things at once: decarbonize and de-risk costs through permitting reform, long-term price signals, and domestic supply chains for energy tech. That's not ideology, it's resilience. Final act: 4 levers that could turn downfall into renewal. 10. Case studies and pressure, rapid fire. United States. Inflation spiked in 2022 and has cooled, but housing affordability remains near historical stress. Migration helped population growth rebound, especially via international inflows. Productivity and housing supply are the fulcrums. Canada. High population growth via immigration with housing supply lag drove affordability to worst on record in key metros. The government is now capping certain temporary pathways to rebalance. Europe. EU. Energy shock plus inflation spike in 2022, improving by 2025 toward target. Housing cost overburden is acute in several cities. Migration flows remained large in 2022 to 2023. Australia. Inflation peaked in late 2022, then fell toward target. Net overseas migration surged post-pandemic before easing. Rents and vacancies remain tight. Housing approvals lag population growth. New Zealand. After record net migration in 2023, policy tightened and net migration dropped. The economy has been stop-start, exposing housing and productivity constraints. So is the West doomed? The answer depends on whether leaders and local communities pull the following 4 levers now. If you've felt the squeeze, you're not imagining it. But now you know where it comes from and what to watch. Housing approvals, capacity-linked immigration, productivity programs for real businesses, and permitting reform. That's the scoreboard. Question of the day: which lever matters most where you live? Tell me in the comments, and I'll feature the best local policy fix in a future video. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who keeps saying, "It's all over for the West." Maybe it's not over, maybe it's overdue.